What would you do if the only thing someone left you, after a lifetime of quiet, faithful love, was a lighthouse that hadn't worked in 30 years? Not a house, not savings, not even the tools of the trade she'd spent 11 years teaching you, hand over hand, page by patient page. Just a decommissioned stone tower on a scrap of bare rock in Georgian Bay. Half a mile from shore, where the wind came off the water like a blade, and nothing grew but lichen, and a few desperate spruce trees holding on with their roots jammed into the cracks. That is what Bernadette Coyle left her niece, Lark Coyle, in the autumn of 1913. And the people of Dunmore Reach had a great deal to say about it. We'll let them have their say, because in a story like this one, the ones who laugh loudest are almost always the ones who understand the least. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let us know in the comments where you're joining us from today, because this is a story worth hearing from wherever you are. The solicitor's office smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, the kind of room that seemed to absorb bad news and hold it in the walls. Lark Coyle sat in a straight-backed chair, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. The way you learn to look at nothing when you are trying very hard not to feel everything at once. Bernadette, Aunt Bern, always Aunt Bern, had been buried 4 days before, in the church cemetery on the hill above town, in the November ground that the gravediggers had to work at with iron bars. Lark had stood at the edge of the grave in her thin coat, and said nothing because there was nothing she could say that was big enough for what she had lost. Bernadette Coyle had taken Lark in when Lark was 11, after her parents were lost to a fever winter that swept through the lumber camps of northern Ontario. She had given her a bed, an education of a particular kind, and a trade, bookbinding. For 11 years, Lark had sat across the workshop table from her aunt and learned how to sew signatures of paper together, how to tool leather with designs that looked like living things, how to use a bone folder to crease a page so cleanly it seemed to want to lie flat forever. She had learned that a book is a kind of vessel, that what matters is not the beauty of the cover, but the integrity of the spine. Aunt Bern had given her that, and now Aunt Bern was gone. Lark's two cousins sat across from her in Mr. Hackett's office. Desmond Coyle was Bernadette's nephew by another branch, a flour merchant with a broad red face, and the look of a man who was already planning how to spend money he hadn't received yet. His wife, Flora, sat beside him with her hands folded, and her hat very straight, as if good posture could make a person appear more deserving. Mr. Hackett, the solicitor, cleared his throat and opened the document. Desmond received the house on Birch Street, the workshop, the inventory of leather and linen thread and gold leaf, the hand press, the sewing frame, all of it, to Desmond. Every tool of the trade that Bernadette Coyle had built up over 30 years of patient labor. Desmond's mouth twitched in satisfaction. Flora allowed herself a small smile. Then Mr. Hackett turned his eyes to Lark. To her niece, Lark Marie Coyle, he read, in the flat voice of a man conveying a document rather than a life. To Lark, I leave the property known as the Coyle Point Light, situated on Riven Rock Island in Georgian Bay, being a lighthouse structure and all land comprising the whole of said island. Approximately 1 acre of rock and sparse vegetation, decommissioned in 1882. May she find in its stone what I can never find in words. Silence. Desmond made a short sound that was almost a laugh. A lighthouse, he said. She's left the girl a lighthouse. Mr. Hackett set the paper down with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. It hasn't been lit since before I was born, Desmond said, turning to Flora. The thing is barely standing. The roof of the lantern room caved in sometime in the 90s. Lark said nothing. She felt the familiar cold of grief settling in, the kind that doesn't make you shiver, the kind that simply occupies you, the way stone occupies a field. She signed the papers with a steady hand. In the street outside, the November wind moved dead leaves across the boardwalk in small, skittering rushes. She stood there with the deed in her coat pocket and Aunt Bern's bone folder in her other hand. She'd carried it out of habit, the way you carry the things that anchor you when the ground has shifted. The bone folder was a simple thing, a strip of deer rib bone, worn smooth by 30 years of use, with a tiny carved leaf at one end that Bernadette had made herself years before Lark was born. It was warm from Lark's hand. It was the only thing in the world that still felt like Aunt Bern. Vernon Patch found her before she'd walked half a block. Vernon Patch was the kind of man who wore his wealth like a second coat and spoke loudly in public places so everyone could appreciate the quality of his opinions. He owned a good portion of the waterfront in Dunmore Reach and had his eye on more of it. He was already tipping his hat with the practiced warmth of someone who has something to gain from appearing kind. "Miss Coyle," he said, loud enough for the people on the boardwalk to hear, "I feel for your situation. That rock in the bay, worthless as a piece of property, I'm afraid. No harbor, no soil to speak of. The lighthouse structure is compromised." He shook his head with a sorrow that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'd give you $20 for it. The stone alone, salvage value. Take the burden right off your shoulders." $20. The tools left to Desmond were worth 50 times that. Lark looked at him with her steady gray eyes. "It was my aunt's," she said. "Sentiment is admirable," he said, "but sentiment won't pay a rooming house bill. It's not for sale, Mr. Patch." His smile held, but something behind it shifted. He tipped his hat again and moved on, and Lark watched him go. She had nowhere else to go. The room she'd shared with Aunt Bern above the workshop had been absorbed into Desmond's inheritance along with everything else. She had her coat, her small traveling bag, a change of clothes, and the bone folder. She had a week's money in her pocket, maybe less. The only thing with her name on it was an island in Georgian Bay that nobody wanted. That evening, old Mrs. Dunbar stopped her on the path by the church. Mrs. Dunbar was the oldest resident of Dunmore Reach, a woman so weathered by lakeside winters that she seemed made of the same gray granite as the shoreline. She had known Bernadette Coyle for 50 years. She did not offer condolences. She just looked at Lark with her pale, careful eyes and said, "Bernadette always told me a well-made thing never looks finished until you understand what it was built to hold." Then she went on her way, her boots crunching on the frozen path. Lark stood in the cold and turned those words over in her mind, the way you turn a stone in a riverbed, looking at the wet underside. A well-made thing never looks finished until you understand what it was built to hold. What had the lighthouse been built to hold? The first weeks Lark spent on Riven Rock Island were among the hardest of her life. She borrowed a rowboat from Ewan Mayer, the young fisherman who kept his gear at the town dock, and who had the quiet, practical goodness of someone who helps without making you feel the weight of being helped. He asked no questions and charged nothing. She rowed herself out to the island in late November with her bag and a sack of provisions, and the moment she dragged the boat up onto the rocks, the wind hit her from 3 directions at once. The island was exactly what the deed had promised. 1 acre of bare shield rock, tilted toward the bay at a slight angle, with the old lighthouse rising from its highest point like a broken tooth. The stone was good, solid Georgian Bay limestone, but the mortar between the courses had crumbled in places, and the iron door at the base had seized with rust. Inside, the spiral staircase was intact, but the lantern room at the top was open to the sky, its frame standing but its glass long since shattered. Leaves and the mummified remains of a starling nest filled one corner. It was bleak, it was cold, it was hers. She set up a rough camp in the base room of the lighthouse. She dragged in driftwood from the shoreline. She ate her provisions carefully and woke each morning to the sound of the bay and the wind worrying the broken iron at the top of the tower. She told herself that her aunt had chosen this place for a reason, and that the reason was somewhere she hadn't looked yet. Because here is what Lark knew about Bernadette Coyle that nobody else in Dunmore Reach seemed to understand. Aunt Bern did not do things without reason. She was a woman who planned the structure of a book before she chose the paper. She built things to last. She had given Lark the bone folder, the last evening they sat together, slipping it into her hand as if it were a simple passing of something ordinary, and not the most deliberate act of love Lark had ever witnessed. Why would she leave this island to Lark? Not Desmond, Lark, the one she had taught, the one she had given the bone folder to. She began to look more carefully. On the 3rd day, she noticed something about the base of the lighthouse. The foundation stones on the landward side were original, rough-cut limestone fitted together with the slightly irregular mortar of the 1850s. But on the seaward side, just where the tower met the rock shelf, there was a section of newer stonework, tighter, cleaner joints, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who paid close attention to things. On the 5th day, she found it. She had been clearing debris from the base of the tower when her boot caught on a lip of rock that didn't belong to the natural geometry of the island. She knelt down and cleared away a mat of dead lichen, and found, fitted so neatly into the stone shelf that it was invisible until you knew to look, a low timber door. No handle, no visible hinge, but along one edge the wood was fractionally darker, worn by a hand, by many hands over many years. Lark pressed. The door swung inward on a counterweighted mechanism, perfectly balanced, making no sound at all. The air that came out was cool and dry. It smelled of leather, of linseed oil, of paper. She lit her lantern and stepped inside. It was not a cellar, it was a workshop. The room had been carved into the rock shelf beneath the lighthouse, not excavated from nothing, but expanded from a natural fissure in the limestone, widened and squared, and lined with fitted stone. The floor was smooth pine planking. A small cast-iron stove occupied one corner, its chimney routed up through a crack in the rock that served brilliantly as a natural flue. A work table ran the length of one wall with a proper sewing frame still rigged, and beside it a rack of tools so familiar that Lark had to hold onto the doorframe for a moment before she could breathe correctly. Awls, needles, burnishers, a paring knife, a small finishing press, handmade, with Aunt Bern's particular way of cutting the wooden cheeks. A jar of paste dried now, but its ghost scent still there. And the walls. Shelves, from floor to low ceiling, covering every surface that wasn't the door or the stove, and on the shelves, books, dozens of them, bound in the unmistakable way that Bernadette Coyle had bound books, with her tight French link stitch and her habit of tooling a single sprig of something living into the lower left corner of every cover. A cedar branch, a fern frond, a cattail. Lark moved along the shelves with her lantern raised. She read the titles marked on the spines in Aunt Bern's precise hand. Flora of Georgian Bay and the Bruce Peninsula, 1891-1908. Accounts of the island communities, Volume I through Volume IV. Letters received, letters written. 3 volumes simply labeled The Women. A series of flat boxes holding pressed botanical specimens, every one of them labeled with location and date. A wooden case containing rock samples from the island, annotated in careful pencil, sketches, maps. 30 years of quiet, systematic, loving attention to a world that had never thought to pay her the same. On the work table, waiting, Lark knew it, in the way you know when something has been waiting, specifically for you, was a book with no title on the spine. When she opened it, a letter fell from inside the front cover. 2 sheets of laid paper, covered in Bernadette's handwriting. My dear Lark, if you are reading this, you came to the island. I knew you would. Desmond would have taken the money and never bothered with the boat. But you were always the one who looked at the spine before you opened the cover. I want to explain the lighthouse. Not the stone and the mortar. Those explain themselves, if you look closely enough. But the reason I spent 30 years coming out here on borrowed rowboats, and then on my own, when my joints would allow it. This island is where I learned to see. The world on shore is very loud, Lark. It tells you what things are worth by the speed at which they can be sold. I came here because here, nothing could be sold, and so I was free to notice everything else. What I built in this room is not simply a workshop. It is a record. The books on those shelves are 30 years of this bay, this sky, these rocks, the people who fished these waters and told me things in quiet moments that they would never have said in town. I want you to have it. Not because you need a lighthouse, but because you need to know that there was a reason you spent 11 years learning to bind books. Not just to make them, to hold something inside them that will outlast us both. Keep the record, Lark. Add to it, not for anyone in particular, just because the world deserves to be paid attention to. All my love in every stitch and every crease, Aunt Bern. Lark sat down on the workbench stool and wept, not from grief alone, though that was there, deep and necessary, but from the specific, almost unbearable feeling of being understood by someone who is no longer there to be thanked. She had not been left with nothing. She had been left with everything Bernadette Coyle had ever truly valued. We want to pause here and ask you something, because we genuinely want to know. Has someone ever left you a thing that looked like nothing at all, until the moment you understood what was inside it? Leave us a comment. We read every one of them. Now let us tell you what happened next. Because winter was not finished with Lark Coyle. She moved properly into the workshop. She brought more supplies from shore with Ewan Mare's quiet assistance, and learned to manage the cast-iron stove. She read her aunt's books by lantern light and began to understand not just what Bernadette had recorded, but how, the patience of it, the refusal to simplify, the way her aunt had let a thing be complicated, because a complicated thing deserved the space. She began to bind a new volume. It started almost as reflex, because her hands needed the work and the tools were there, and because there was already so much happening on that island that deserved to be written down. She titled it in pencil on the inside cover, lightly, until she could decide on something permanent. what I've seen so far. January came in hard off the bay. The ice formed in the shallows and the crossing from town became unreliable. Ewan Mayer made the trip when he could, and once he couldn't, and Lark spent 8 days alone with the stove and the lantern and the silence that the ice made. A different silence than open water, heavier, more absolute. She learned that a silence like that is not empty. It is full of things you cannot hear when the world is loud. Then, on a Friday morning in late January, the storm came. It arrived from the northwest with almost no warning, the way the worst ones always do in Georgian Bay. The sky going yellow-green in the early afternoon. The temperature dropping 20 degrees in an hour. The wind building from a steady push to a howl to something beyond naming. The ice in the shallows cracked and moaned. The waves that pushed in from open water were enormous and gray-green. Lark secured the workshop door and climbed to the lighthouse base room to wait it out. It was through the narrow window slit in the tower wall, 2 hours into the storm, that she saw them. A small dory had been pushed onto the rocks at the eastern edge of the island, the worst edge, the sharpest. It had broken up partway, one side staved in. 3 figures clung to the rocks, a woman and 2 children, one very small, all of them moving with the frantic, mechanical motion of people who are cold beyond feeling it. Lark was moving before she made any decision. She grabbed the length of rope she'd stored in the base room, tied one end around the iron stanchion, bolted into the lighthouse wall, and went out into the storm. What she did in the next 40 minutes she never described in detail afterward. It was not the kind of thing that fits neatly into words. She went down the rock face to the water's edge. She threw the rope. She shouted herself hoarse over the wind. She hauled and braced and hauled again. The 2 children first. A girl of perhaps 7 and a boy no more than 4, both of them white-lipped and limp with cold, and then the woman Alice Ogilvy, who came over the rocks on her hands and knees and made no sound at all, until she was inside the lighthouse base room, and Lark had the stove going and both children wrapped in every blanket that existed on that island. Then Alice Ogilvy made a single sound that contained everything a person can feel when the worst has passed. The storm blew for 2 more days. They rode it out together in the workshop, all 4 of them, which was warmer and drier than the base room. Alice stood in the middle of it and looked around with the expression of someone who has stepped inside a miracle and is trying to remember how to breathe normally. "What is this place?" she asked. "My aunt's," Lark said, "and now mine, I suppose." When the weather broke and Ewan Mayer crossed with his boat to check on the island, he found 4 people instead of 1, and the story went back to shore ahead of them. By the time Lark rode in with the Ogilvys, there was already a small crowd at the dock. Alice was not a quiet woman under ordinary circumstances. She told the story of the hidden workshop in the rock, the shelves of books her aunt had made over 30 years, the stove that burned while the storm raged, and the young woman with a bone folder in her pocket who had come out into that wind and hauled her children off the rocks one by one. The crowd went quiet, then they went curious. Vernon Patch was among them. He said nothing. 2 days later, a small group made the crossing in Ewan Mayer's boat. The mayor, the minister, the schoolteacher Miss Tully, Mr. Hackett the solicitor, and Vernon Patch. Lark met them at the rocks without ceremony, led them to the workshop door, showed them how the counterweighted hinge worked, and let them go inside. She watched Vernon Patch run a hand along a shelf of Bernadette's books. She watched him open the volume labeled Accounts of the Island Communities, Volume Y, and read a single page with his brow furrowed, not in disapproval, but in the specific confusion of a man, encountering something whose value he cannot convert into a familiar unit of measurement. Miss Tully stood in the center of the room, with tears running down her face, reading the spines one by one. Mr. Hackett took out his measuring tape, force of professional habit, and measured the room and the land, and then consulted the deed. He stood up straight and looked at Lark. "The deed specifies the island in its entirety," he said to the assembled group. "Every inch of rock, every structure on it, including any subsurface structures. All of it was Bernadette Coyle's to give, and it is Lark Coyle's to keep." He paused. "I have been a solicitor for 22 years. I have never read a will that understood what it was doing as clearly as this one." Vernon Patch said nothing on the crossing back. He stood at the bow and looked out at the open water. As they tied up at the dock, he turned and found Lark watching him. He did not mention another price. He nodded to her, once, deliberate, and walked up the dock, and that was the last time he ever spoke of Riven Rock Island as though it were something to be salvaged. Spring came to Georgian Bay the way it always does in that part of the country, not gently, but decisively, as though a decision had been made overnight and the world was simply carrying it out. The ice broke up with a sound like slow cannon fire. The first boats went out, and Lark Coyle, in the workshop on Riven Rock Island, opened a new volume and began to write. People made the crossing, not in crowds. Lark had no interest in making the island a spectacle, but one or two people who had heard the story and wanted to see Bernadette's books, or who had something to add to them, or who simply wanted to see the place a woman had spent 30 quiet years building into something the rest of the world had called worthless. A historian from the university in Toronto wrote asking if he might study the botanical records. A woman from the Ojibwe community at Cape Croker sent a letter asking if the volumes labeled "The Women" contained the stories she believed they might, and whether they might discuss them. Ewan Mayer helped Lark repair the lighthouse door and replace the most damaged sections of mortar in the tower. He was good with stone, better than he admitted, and he worked without talking much, which Lark appreciated, because she was beginning to understand that quiet and loneliness are entirely different things, and that confusing them can cost you a great deal. One evening in June, with the bay flat and the light going golden and sideways across the water, Lark sat at her aunt's work table and looked at what was in front of her, the bone folder resting in its usual spot, warm from being carried all day. A half-finished binding, its signature sewn and waiting for the cover. A new volume taking shape, her own entries filling in behind Bernadette's, the handwriting different but the intention the same. The smell of leather and linseed. The sound of the water outside, which she had long since stopped hearing, as something separate from herself. It was simply the sound of where she lived. Aunt Bern had not built the lighthouse to guide ships. She had built what was behind it to guide one specific person, the right one, to the right place at the right time. Lark picked up the bone folder and creased the next page flat. The paper lay down smooth and clean and willing, the way it always did when the fold was made with care. She thought of what the will had said. May she find in its stone what I could never find in words. She had found it. Not in the stone itself, but in everything the stone had been quietly protecting. The record, the work, the love that doesn't announce itself, but simply builds, year after careful year, and waits to be discovered by the one person who knows how to look. A well-made thing never looks finished until you understand what it was built to hold. Lark Coyle understood now, and she had a great deal of work still to do.